Ohayo gozaimasu, and welcome to this video in which I am going to offer a slightly belated review or reviews of Kurosawa Kiyoshi's most recent film, Cloud, a film that was released theatrically last year to general acclaim and which has just been released on Blu-ray in many countries. I say reviews because I think this is a film that the more you watch it, the more you see that there are actually potentially several films going on here, or at least several different ways of approaching what seems to be a fairly straightforward narrative. But I've seen and read different reviews that have had different takes on the film. In terms of the predominant tone, the predominant genre, and I think this is a road that I want to both follow and extend for longer than I've seen it extended in the reviews, the commentaries that I have so far come across. So this is going to be cloud formations, different takes, different readings of what this film means, what it does, and let's get started. Okay, so Cloud concerns a young man who is an online reseller, someone who has a side hustle that becomes a living, in which he buys items that he finds and sells them for a marked up price online. And in doing this, he manages to accrue a number of different, let's call them enemies, who ultimately band together and come after him to put a stop to his, what is in their mind, nefarious activities. Now, perhaps the most obvious way of thinking about Cloud, as several critics have done, is as some kind of action thriller. There's a quote on the poster here that this is a hyperkinetic thriller. I'm not sure what film this particular critic has seen or what they've seen in it that I didn't, but feel free to disagree in comments. I didn't see this as a hyperkinetic action thriller. Indeed, for the most part, there's very little action, at least in the sense that audiences would know and expect if they were led to believe that something was a kinetic action thriller. That suggests to me something pacey, something built around stylized set pieces. There is a fairly protracted shootout, for want of a better word, at the end of the film, but it's nothing that is hyperkinetic, as the protagonist and his helper try and evade and at the same time take out those who have been hunting them. This takes place in and around a sort of disused factory, and it is action, but it's not action that I think an audience would be satisfied with, a mainstream audience at least would be satisfied with, were they to go into this film or watch this film thinking that it is, again, a hyperkinetic thriller. The point of this set piece in amongst or in the context of the narrative as it has unfolded to that point strikes me as something like Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs. Now, I'm sure this is not coincidental. Those of you who've watched Kurosawa's films, who've seen or read interviews with this director, will know his reverence for US genre cinema. Not auteur-based genre cinema necessarily, but his reverence for films by the likes of Robert Aldrich, Richard Fleischer, Peckinpah, people who have taken genre films and imbued them with a certain thematic resonance, a certain thematic weight, whilst in no way frustrating or negating the pleasures associated with and the expectations of audiences toward quote unquote genre material. And whilst I would argue that Kurosawa does not uphold any sense of these generic pleasures in the same way that the directors he lionizes do, nonetheless, the fact of offering a specific thematic substance within the context of a genre film is something that has long defined his work. As I said here, something like Straw Dogs is key to the extent that the protagonist in Cloud, Yoshi Ryosuke, is someone who has to turn to violence to sort of escape the pit into which he has been cast, and has to engage with something like the primal sense of conflict, of violence, of action in the sort of purest sense of the term, in order to survive. In effect, he has to reach down and dig down into the sense of acting, of performing an action, in this case a violent action or actions, in order to extricate himself from a web, the fact of his being caught in which is largely his own making. The particular resonance of this, of acting in this sense, and this is where I think it is an action film, it's about action, the actions that the protagonist must undertake, rather than action in the sense of this being a thriller based around, I don't know, car chases, extended stylized battles, etc., etc. The resonance of this is that he is someone who has had no sort of truck with or connection to this type of behavior. Indeed, as the title Cloud suggests, his life, his identity has been tied up with online activities, with activities that take place in, as it were, a different world, an online world, a virtual world, the world in which he operates under a different name, a kind of different identity, and in which, like the ghosts in Kurosawa's Pulse, there is a spillage, or from which there's a spillage, where what takes place in this online world sort of bleeds over into Ryosuke's quote-unquote real life and forces him to act in a sort of defensive way, as I said, to behave in a sense primordially, to engage in the sort of bare sort of essentials of combat, of action, in order to survive. It's almost like reaching into a deep, dark sort of corner of human history in order to drag up this, for this character at least, suppressed sense of just what he is capable of. So the action is really interestingly placed and pronounced beside this sense of sort of inaction, if you like. The character's life has been characterized by inaction. He's a fairly sort of dour and unremarkable person in many ways. And it's only through this sort of assumed online identity that he is able to make any headway. But that, at the same time, is something that then necessitates this this sense of acting, of engaging in action in the real world, in terms of being physical, engaging with a sense of corporeal identity rather than this sort of constructed, fabricated online presence and identity. So in the sense that this is sort of about what his actions, his violent actions mean, this is an action film. But you could just as well think of it as sort of, in a sense, deconstructing action films, because it's about getting us to think about what the action means, rather than being sort of seduced by something balletic or stylized or kinetic, as the quote I alluded to earlier has it. Just being excited and sort of physically moved by action, in the sense that we often are in mainstream cinema. So this is kind of about action films, I think, as much as it is an action film. Okay, so as is the case with several earlier Kurosawa films, I think perhaps most notably the ecological thriller Charisma, and the strange drama Doppelganger, Cloud can be viewed as an allegory. Now, an allegory of what is certainly open to question, and I've encountered one or two different readings. Most notably, one by Jonathan Root, who is an expert in Japanese cinema and who talks about this film sort of extrapolating from online sales and the dangerous sort of subterfuge thereof, in order to construct an allegory of online behaviors that then spill over into and have very real consequences within the quote-unquote real world. And he talks about things like people posting perceived sort of extreme social and political views that then can lead to things like societal unrest, like riots, if you like. There is some obvious validity to this. I'm not sure the extent to which I fully buy into it. It's an intriguing idea, but I think it's the extent to which there's enough substance in Ryosuke's online selling to sort of substantiate or give enough thematic credence to this is open to question. It's certainly there, but to my mind, a more potent allegory suggests itself by considering a particular dichotomy that not only animates and structures this film, but has very obvious antecedents in Kurosawa's oeuvre. I think the notion of real or fake, which emerges in this film in discussions over the validity or otherwise of or the veracity, I should say, or otherwise, of the goods that Ryosuke sells. So whether he's selling real designer goods or fake designer goods, is something that I've not heard too many people comment upon, but I think this is one of the real keys to the film. The notion of what is real is one that that penetrates and is used as a point of departure in several Kurosawa films. I think I've already mentioned the obvious echoes of Pulse, the J-horror classic from 2001 in this film, in things that happen or things that kind of exist online, spilling over into the quote-unquote real world. But then making the characters, and by extension us, the audience, question that reality, that real world. Because if we're seeing things and experiencing things for which we have no or very little frame of reference, then our grasp of or understanding of the limits, the parameters of the real world become frustrated, and we have to sort of rethink reality, the very fabric of reality. In 2013, Kurosawa made a film entitled Real. This is a film that is yet to benefit from widespread international visibility. It's a thriller of sorts. I think we always have to qualify Kurosawa's work when we talk about them being thrillers. I think most of his films kind of adopt thriller elements, but in very strange, often subversive ways. But in Real, it's the story of a young artist, a manga artist, in a coma, and the cutting edge therapy or cutting edge treatment thereof that allows her partner to sort of enter her mind, if you like. It's a little bit like Kurosawa riffing on Inception. And there are all sorts of ways that entering into someone else's subconscious then has ramifications for that character's attitudes and experiences in the, again, quote unquote, real world. This is ultimately a film that resolves itself with the appearance of a dinosaur. So hopefully that will sell you on wanting to watch it. It's not in any way Kurosawa's best film or even among his best films, but it is fascinating. And as the title suggests, it is a film that wants us very much to reconsider what we think of as real, to think about obviously the world that we live in and the way that we experience that. But if we're able to enter someone else's psyche, their mind, their unconscious mind, and given that the unconscious mind obviously affects our lives in very obvious ways, I mean, think about dreams, hallucinations. These are things that we can talk about as real. We may see things that are not there, in the case of a hallucination. But the fact that our brain is processing information in a way that projects these images or narratives in the case of dreams means that they are, in a way, sort of escaping into the real world that we otherwise would think of as kind of separate to that. So there's a reality to the mind. There's kind of a subjective reality. And the probing of the sort of slippage between these two realities is something that structures this film. So the import in Cloud of this sort of critical, exploratory engagement with reality and the real comes from the fact that the protagonist, like the protagonist in Doppelganger, although much less explicitly so, exists in a kind of fractured dual form. There's the character Yoshi Ryosuke, a sometime sort of menial industrial worker, and someone wanting to engage in selling online. And there's the persona that is created in this film. He becomes known online by the moniker Rattel. And that is a kind of separate self, if you like, that is created through his online activities, through selling objects, various different things. There's no specific object that he, or type of object that he sort of sells or collects. We see dolls, we see handbags, we see medical equipment at the beginning of the film. So there's this sort of mirror, if you like. There's Yoshi Ryosuke and there's Rattel. And I think this sort of opens up a dimension wherein we can see a sort of performative online self being created. And to me, this has very obvious sort of ramifications for just about everyone in a day and age where we're all online, where we're all on social media, where it seems we all spend a majority of our time interacting virtually and electronically rather than in person. The fact that we can see a sort of separate self that nonetheless sort of slips over oftentimes into our real world, given that we're obviously interacting through sort of physical objects like a computer, or obviously in most cases a smartphone. The fact that we sort of project an image of ourselves through this, that contrasts, I think, in all kinds of ways with our quote unquote real selves, is really interesting. And some of the ramifications or consequences that Kurosawa underlines here suggest that there isn't a kind of real self against which we judged our performative sort of social media or online avatars. He suggests that it's not about two distinct sort of mutually exclusive identities or selves, but rather what we create, what we project online, actually suggests that there's a fallibility or a frailty to our real selves, that it's not stable, it's not singular, it's not homogeneous, but rather it's open to being corrupted, it's open to being frustrated in terms of who we imagine we are. And the self, the type of person that we want others to perceive us as. And it's that, I think it's that other self that becomes sort of personified or made manifest in the men that ultimately come after Ryosuke when the film enters the sort of thriller or action film territory in its latter stages for the extended last act. They become like something akin to a sort of return of the repressed. It's the violence that we sort of do to ourselves and others through this sense of frustrating any coherent or real concept of identity. Coming back, being visited back upon this character. So if there is an allegorical dimension to this film, then that's what I think it's engaging with. And as I've said, for a for a director such as Kurosawa, who was engaging in a very thoughtful and penetrating way with the internet sort of 25 years ago, for him to return to that suggests something of the of a return, I think, to earlier filmmaking modes after a departure like Wife of a Spy, which was his previous feature, his first period film. Here and in a short film made the same year called Chimes or Chime. I think Kurosawa is returning to that climate of sort of creeping dread and unease and tension that characterizes his earlier films, his more overtly horror-based films. So I think we can see this as an allegory, and we can see it as a kind of horror film. You know, concepts like the return of the repressed, plus the links to the J horror film that I've already mentioned, suggest that another genre that we can think about with regard to Cloud is the horror film. Those of you who are seasoned viewers of Kurosawa's films will have noted in several the central animating, you may say anchoring presence of a marriage. Usually one that is fraught with different kinds of turmoil, usually owing to the professional circumstances of the husband. A film that he made almost 20 years ago, Tokyo Sonata, to date his only real home drama or shomingeki, exemplifies this trend with its narrative built around a husband who loses his job and attempts to keep this fact from his wife and family. Kurosawa's previous film, Wife of a Spy, as the title perhaps suggests, is built around a marriage in quite a surprising way, I thought, and quite a moving way. It's a film that I expected to be constructed around the problematic consequences of the apparent protagonist, the wife of the title, being married to a spy. In fact, although there are consequences for her, the notion of spying is never as clear-cut in this film as you may think. And the fact of being married to a man who may be involved in spying, working against his country, in effect for his enemies during World War II, the very early years of World War II, just prior to America's involvement, is something that actually brings them together. It's almost like the spark of threat and danger actually animates their love for one another. And the wife in particular seems, although she has issues with what her husband's doing, she seems drawn ever closer to him by becoming herself embroiled in his activities. I think Cloud continues this trend, although it's not a marriage at its centre. The relationship between Ryosuke and his girlfriend, who comes to live with him when he moves house. He moves out of a fairly small, pokey apartment into a quite a spacious country home when he quits his job and devotes himself, as it were, to becoming an online reseller. She comes to live with him, and although, as I said, it's not quite as central to this film. Indeed, it's an aspect of the film that has been largely unremarked upon, or certainly not in any great detail. It is actually thematically central to this other take on the film that I'm proposing, that of a kind of satire of married life and married domesticity. Kurosawa has, in the past, made films that reflect on more or less everyday aspects of our lives, and satirize them, allegorize them through quote unquote extreme genre material. I'm thinking of something like his blackly comic slasher film, The Guard from Underground, which sort of effectively takes aim at salaryman and corporate culture in Japan. And I think Cloud, in some ways, picks up the mantle from this film and one or two other earlier films. Doppelganger, with Yakusho Koji in more than one role, is also a notable predecessor here. It takes an exaggerated dramatic conceit, and I think through that satirizes the notion of a marriage, of practices based around marriages in Japan, expectations, responsibilities, especially at key times of social unrest, social turmoil, the sort of economic instability, to say the least, that has characterized Japan for much of the last almost 4 decades. I'm going to stay more or less spoiler free here. Obviously, I think with any review, you'll get more out of an engagement with a film if you are familiar with the film, if you've seen it. But I'm not going to offer any direct spoilers. Maybe just sort of dance around some here. Although it's not as though there are any big twists in the tale here. But it's very notable. The narrative sort of jumps forward quite abruptly at times here. And I think this relates to Ryosuke's relationship with his girlfriend, which seems potentially close, but on both sides, quite distant, quite hesitant, as though each sort of maybe marking time, maybe with the other in lieu of anything better, and without really much of a thought as to how far into the future their relationship may stretch. We get the feeling that if they remain together, that would be fine. But if not, that is kind of okay as well. And it's made plain in no uncertain terms that Ryosuke's girlfriend is kind of worn down by her job. She has a fairly menial job, and what she would like to do is sort of pack that in and be a kept woman to have Ryosuke sort of look after her and keep her in a lap of luxury, so she has money to spend without necessarily having to earn it herself. She moves in with Ryosuke when Ryosuke repairs to the large detached country home, lakeside home that I have previously mentioned. And the jump to this is quite abrupt and occurs after a key scene, a very Kurosawa-like scene, in that it sort of all of a sudden turns on a moment of almost heart-stopping tension. There's a moment when Ryosuke talks to an apparently close friend of his, although again it's a relationship based on a sort of mutual convenience and dependency rather than any real friendship. But they meet, and Ryosuke's girlfriend happens upon them. They are having a conversation at a bus stop, and the protagonist's girlfriend happens upon them, and there is a sense of profound sort of disquiet and awkwardness as the friend and the girlfriend meet and in some ways size each other up. And quite out of the blue, Ryosuke talks about how he plans to marry her. When they're on the bus, Ryosuke's girlfriend asks him if he's serious, and he sort of says, yeah, I guess so. You know, I said it, so I must be, is kind of the inference. Again, it's sort of either marrying or not is fine. The underlying sort of feeling is that he said this in the moment to get out of a sort of socially awkward meeting. But then there's a strange moment when Ryosuke apparently becomes cognizant of a strange presence on the bus, someone sitting behind him, potentially eavesdropping. And as this character gets up and exits the bus, we never see, it looks like a shadow. It actually looks, in fact, like a ghost. Like the kind of spectral figures that we've seen in earlier Kurosawa films. But the diegetic, the ambient sound all sort of bleeds out, and there's this very tense moment of complete silence before we get this sort of propulsion into the future, if you like, to Ryosuke already having moved house and having set up this detached lakeside home as a base for his business operations, as well as a home with his girlfriend, and the two sort of awkwardly coexist. That's both the two characters and the two facets of life and livelihood that are contained within this house. So it's a space of domesticity, of living, but it's also a space of business, of work. It looks like an old warehouse in places, as it's full of boxes and the material goods that Ryosuke is selling. And this gives way. It looks like a fairly open plan house, and this sort of warehouse feel is not sort of physically compartmentalized or separated from the more overt sort of living spaces, like a living room and a kitchen. Indeed, they seem to give onto each other directly. So there's this awkward sense of sort of coexistence, which reflects the cohabitation, I think, of these two characters. It's fascinating, I think, that this kind of horror moment, this moment of unsettling sort of disquiet, emerges straight after, almost as it were out of, this decision to get married, to repair to the country together. It's almost as though the horror is sort of born from this moment, and the violence that ensues when Ryosuke's attackers, his enemies, sort of besiege this house when they find out who he is and where he lives. Again, it's almost like a sort of physical, genre-based manifestation of the unease that has accrued around this relationship that has been awkwardly taken to the next level. This marriage, or almost marriage, that's been built on very sort of shaky, sandy foundations, if you like. I think what we see actually as this ultimately develops is a kind of mirror image or inverse of Straw Dogs, where it's kind of an attack on the completely innocent woman at the heart of the drama that precipitates the home invasion and the male protagonist sort of descending into violence. Here, the descent into violence is not precipitated by the innocent sort of wife, girlfriend figure. Rather, she becomes ultimately, in various ways, complicit in it. And it is her apparent desire for sort of material possessions, for material comfort, even for material wealth, that leads ultimately to a kind of complication in the narrative right at the end. And those reviews that have seen this film as something of a dark comedy, again, like perhaps The God from Underground, may do well to look more closely at this aspect of the film and kind of link that to this portrait of a marriage, of which, as I've already mentioned, Kurosawa has offered several over the course of his career. So with that in mind, I think it behoves us to see here this sort of slightly exaggerated comedic look at the tensions between husband and wife, sort of materialized in this sort of outsized, exaggerated, masculine display of violence. So there's a sense that the woman is something of an aggressor here, but it's also the case that I think it's masculine action, masculine expectation, the sense of placing the man at the center of everything, as in a patriarchal society that Japan still is, that actually sort of positions the woman in the various roles that she occupies. I've come across criticisms of this film that the female character is quite thinly sketched and ultimately not positive. I'm not sure why anyone would expect this film, or any film really, to have a positive female character. That I can only imagine that from this we are to infer a very deep sense of a woke expectation that gender equality must be addressed at all times. But I think Kurosawa is having a bit of fun here with notions of quote-unquote toxic masculinity. I don't think in Japan there is the same discourse around toxic masculinity as we've seen in the West. But I think certain films have begun to address it in kind of roundabout, exaggerated, genre-based ways. I think The Boxman recently does this, and I'll be reviewing that film shortly. Miike Takashi's Blade of the Immortal is a film that ultimately has a kind of quasi-serious, quasi-comedic foot in the camp of exaggerating and extrapolating from toxic masculinity. And I think here there is that sense of it being problematic, but it is so kind of outlandishly problematic that it becomes almost sort of comedic, almost surreal. And I think Kurosawa is kind of challenging us to take this seriously, I think, as opposed to just offering up what seems like a dramatic narrative conceit playing itself out. The key here then is that the violence that we see visited upon Ryosuke kind of represents some sort of manifestation of the figurative violence that is entailed in his relationship with his girlfriend. The fact that they, in a sense, cater to or pander to each other's perhaps baser instincts. The fact that each sort of tacitly, perhaps carelessly, supports the other's actions that in turn reflect and are enacted on and by them in ways that run counter to their sort of best interests. This is especially prevalent, I think, in the trajectory of Ryosuke's girlfriend and how she ultimately comes to behave. I think as much as, if not more than reflecting badly on her as a character, her materialism, if you like. I think she is responding to a way in which she has been positioned by Ryosuke as someone who's the perception of who relates to the sort of lowest common denominator or denominators of femininity, of, you know, not working, of staying at home, of expecting sort of material comfort. These are things that she ultimately sort of throws in Ryosuke's face, and I think the fact that her actions echo those of Ryosuke's more obvious sort of enemies and hunters suggests something about the extent to which their violence, the hunters' violence, is also a violence that is in a way enacted by Ryosuke's girlfriend, but also sort of visited figuratively upon her. And it's that heady mix that I think Kurosawa is sort of tracing here. And I think ultimately this may be the most penetrating and convincing, or at least detailed, reading of this film. As I've suggested, there are other ways of reading this film. I think it could be read as a horror film. Some have read it as a black comedy, and I think the strangeness and perhaps exaggeratedness of ultimately the conceit perhaps lends itself to this. It's about that sense that we often get, as I've already mentioned in Kurosawa, the fact that reality is malleable, reality is unstable. I guess we could say nothing is real until it is, you know, and this is something that Japanese history perhaps teaches us. You know, the atom bomb, for instance, which is in a sense allegorized in Pulse, and indeed directly visualized and referenced in Pulse. The atom bomb was unthinkable, was deemed completely unreal until it was real, until it was unleashed. And typically, reality at any given point is only as stable or as convincing or as all-encompassing as our experience of the world. or our beliefs perhaps, or perceptions about the world. And it's this tension that Kurosawa's films so brilliantly explore with such precision, such sort of tension, and it makes him almost unique. I don't think I can recall many, if any, other directors who were so attuned to this theme and who, through exaggerated and perhaps esoteric narrative conceits, touch on aspects of the human condition in such a sort of fundamental way. Okay, I'm hoping that you've seen Cloud. If not, you certainly should be rushing out to see it. Comment down below. Let me know what you think of this film and Kurosawa in particular. Like, subscribe, or don't. Thank you very much for watching as always. I'll be writing some Kurosawa reviews for my website, culturaljapan.com, so look out for those. Follow my musings and ramblings on X at AdamBingham01, and stay tuned for much more content in the very near future. Bye for now.